On the evening that Queen Margaret died, the entire kingdom held its breath, not because her death was unexpected, but because her body vanished before the funeral fire could be lit. For 73 years, Margaret had reigned over Valdoria with the kind of steady hand that makes history forget to write about you. She wasn't remembered for grand conquests or brilliant reforms. Instead, she was remembered for being there, at harvests, at trials, at the bedsides of dying nobles. She was the sort of queen who made the kingdom feel less like a dominion and more like a home. When she died peacefully in her chambers at the age of 94, attendants found her with her eyes open, staring not at the ceiling, but at something beyond it, something that made them believe she'd seen where she was going. The death itself had been anticipated for weeks. Margaret had grown frail in her final months, though her mind remained sharp as winter ice. She had begun to speak less frequently, spending long hours in contemplation, looking out the windows of her tower toward the far mountains that bordered Valdoria. The physicians said it was a natural decline, the body finally surrendering after nearly a century of life. The priests said it was the approach of the eternal rest that all mortals must eventually meet. Her son, Prince Thomas, said nothing at all, but held vigil at her bedside, watching as his mother's breathing slowed and finally ceased. When the moment came, it was so quiet that no one was entirely certain it had happened at all. One moment Margaret was present, the next she was not in any dramatic way, but the way a light goes out when you close your eyes. The attending physician checked her pulse, listened for breath, and confirmed what everyone already knew. The Queen of Valdoria was dead. The servants followed protocol. They sent word throughout the castle and the city beyond. They began the solemn work of preparing the body for the ceremony of the eternal flame, a rite that Valdorians had performed for their monarchs for 2,000 years. A message was sent to the high priestess Keyleth, who lived in the Temple of the Seven Stars 2 miles from the castle. Keyleth was ancient herself, 86 years old, and still sharp, still commanding respect through the sheer force of her presence and her devotion to the old ways. Keyleth received the news in the pre-dawn darkness from a messenger who had ridden hard through the night. She listened without interrupting, her weathered face betraying nothing. When the messenger finished, she stood slowly, leaning on a staff of ash wood carved with the symbols of her office. "I will be there as the sun rises," she said. "Let no one touch the Queen's body until I have performed the initial blessing. These are the old rules, and they will be observed." The messenger bowed and departed, riding back toward the castle with the priestess's message. What he didn't know was that Keyleth's hands were shaking as she walked to the temple's highest chamber to prepare herself. The castle was a place of controlled chaos when Keyleth arrived. Servants moved through the halls with the practiced efficiency of those who had performed this dance before. Banners and shades of morning white had already begun to appear. The royal guard had doubled its watch. Thomas was in the great hall, receiving condolences from his council, his face a careful mask of grief and duty. The guards at the door bowed deeply and stepped aside. Her role was to commune with the divine, to ensure that the soul's passage was proper and the body was sanctified. The physician and steward withdrew, closing the doors behind him. She had felt something strange since the moment the news arrived, a peculiar sensation, like the world had shifted slightly on its axis, like reality had adjusted itself in some subtle but fundamental way. The body was still there. She could see it plainly. Margaret lay on the white silk sheets, dressed in her formal robes, her long white hair arranged carefully on the pillow. The body looked like a representation of Margaret, not Margaret herself. Keyleth approached slowly, her staff clicking against the stone floor with each step. She reached out and touched the Queen's hand. She moved her hand away, and that's when she saw it, the shimmer. It clung to the air like heat, shimmer off summer stone. But it was more solid than that, more real. It was like light itself had somehow been given weight and texture. The moment her finger made contact, the shimmer dissolved. She knew that Margaret hadn't died. Or rather, she had died, but not in any simple sense. The Queen had been offered a choice that came once perhaps in 1,000 years, in that peculiar moment when the boundary between life and death grew thin enough to be permeable. She had been given the option to move on to whatever waits beyond this life, or to remain. Keyleth stood in the chamber as light began to creep through the windows, and she made a decision that would alter the course of her own life and the history of Valdoria. She said nothing to the waiting servants and officials. Instead, she performed a solemn ritual over Margaret's empty shell, speaking the old prayers, making the proper gestures. The form remained. Only the nature of what inhabited it had changed. When she emerged from the chamber, her face was composed, but her eyes were wet with tears that she did not try to hide. No one suspected that she had just become the sole keeper of the most profound secret in Valdorian history. 3 nights later, after all the ceremonies had been completed, and the kingdom had begun its period of official mourning after Margaret's empty body had been cremated, and her ashes had been scattered in the river that ran through the capital. The rooms were sealed now, kept locked as was customary after a monarch's death. The priestess had to use an ancient key that her office maintained, a key that had been passed down through countless generations of high priestesses. She let herself in quietly, almost reverently, and sat down in the center of the floor where Margaret's bed had been. The chamber was empty now of furniture, stripped clean according to tradition. Only the stone floor remained, and the windows that looked out over Valdoria in all its sleeping magnificence. Keyleth held her candle aloft and whispered into the darkness. "If you're here," she said, her voice barely above a breath, "if you're anywhere at all, if this wasn't just the imaginings of an old woman's mind, I've kept your secret. I haven't spoken a word. Not to Thomas, not to the council, not to the priests of the temple. I've kept the silence. Show me why. Show me what you've become." For a long moment, nothing happened. Keyleth began to wonder if her mind had simply filled in the gaps, if she had made up the whole story as a way of coping with Margaret's death. The Queen had been her closest friend, her spiritual companion, her North Star. Perhaps grief had simply invented what she needed to believe. But then the residue began to appear. It started in the corners of the chamber, drawn from the emptiness itself like iron filings to a magnet. It coalesced slowly, rising from the floor, gathering above the priestess-like smoke that had somehow learned to flow upward and inward at the same time. It moved with a terrible beauty, and Keyleth found herself unable to look away, though the sight hurt her eyes in a way that was not physical pain, but something deeper, pain that came from witnessing something that the human form was not quite designed to see. The residue formed no recognizable shape. It was not Margaret's face or her hands or any part of her physical body. It was instead a pattern, a geometry, a dance of light and substance that hurt to view directly, but was infinitely comforting in its periphery. It was like looking at something beyond the 3 dimensions of the world, something that occupied space in a way that space was not quite equipped to contain. And in that moment, understanding flowed into Keyleth like water through a broken dam. She understood that Margaret hadn't died. She understood that the Queen had been offered a choice, the kind of choice that transcends mortal categories, that moves beyond the binary of life and death. She could have gone forward into whatever waits beyond this life. That was the normal way. That was what souls were meant to do. But Margaret had seen something that changed her mind. Standing in that moment between life and death, in that peculiar space where one can see both directions simultaneously, Margaret had looked at her kingdom and realized that the work was not finished. The people still needed her, not in the way they needed a living monarch that could be handled by Thomas and by the structures of governance that she had carefully built. But they needed her in another way. They needed the particular form of attention that she had given her entire life. the consciousness that a great queen pours into her people. Keyleth was the translator. Keyleth was the one who took what Margaret understood and transformed it into counsel that Thomas could follow, suggestions that his advisors could implement. It was exhausting and lonely and sacred all at once. Years passed, and the strange arrangement became the foundation of Valdoria's continued prosperity. Thomas ruled. Thomas was praised. Thomas received the credit for his kingdom's success. And behind the scenes, Margaret continued to pour herself into the land she loved, expressing through Keyleth's words the same care and attention she had always given her people. Keyleth grew older. Her hands began to shake. Her eyes became dimmed by cataracts that made the world seem perpetually shrouded in mist. But her connection to Margaret, if anything, grew stronger. The priestess would spend longer and longer in the sealed chamber, sometimes emerging after what felt like minutes to discover that entire days had passed. Time seemed to move differently in that room, or perhaps it was that Keyleth was learning to move through time in a different way, to exist in the same mode as Margaret existed, partially outside the normal flow of events, partially present to all moments at once. One night, when Keyleth was in her 75th year and had been serving as the bridge between Margaret and the living world for 40 years, something changed. The priestess entered the sealed chamber as she did most nights, prepared to sit in silence and receive whatever instruction Margaret had for Thomas or the kingdom. But tonight, the residue took on a quality unlike anything Keyleth had experienced before. Instead of the usual gentle presence, there was something like urgency. The shimmer swirled around the priestess more rapidly, and Keyleth understood, as she always understood Margaret's communications, what was being conveyed. This was a transition. This was an ending of sorts. Not the ending of Margaret as presence. The queen would never truly leave Valdoria, but the ending of Keyleth's role as the primary bridge. The priestess's time of being Margaret's sole voice in the world was coming to an end. "You're going," Keyleth whispered aloud, and the words hurt as they came out of her mouth. She had known this day was coming, somewhere in the deep places of her understanding, but knowing and experiencing are different things. The light that was Margaret did not answer with words. Light could not speak, but it touched Keyleth's forehead, and in that touch was a transfer of something, not knowledge exactly, but a knowing. Keyleth understood that her time as the bridge between worlds was ending, but she understood why. She understood that Thomas's daughter, Eleanor, had been born the same year that Keyleth had turned 60. Eleanor was now old enough to understand what Keyleth had understood, that her grandmother had not truly left Valdoria. The child had always been sensitive to the strange warmth in certain rooms, the peculiar quality of light in certain corners of the castle. She had asked questions that her father found odd but endearing. Questions about whether people could choose to stay, about whether love was strong enough to keep someone near even after they died. Questions that made it clear she could feel what Keyleth felt, that she was sensitive to the same presence, the same attentiveness. Keyleth understood that Margaret had been waiting for Eleanor as she had waited for Keyleth. 3 bridges, perhaps. 3 generations of guardians. 3 hands to pass the secret through. But before that passing could happen, before Keyleth could fully explain her role to Eleanor and pass on the burden and the joy of it, the priestess needed to prepare. She needed to ensure that Thomas understood, at least partially, what had been done in his name. And she needed to help Eleanor understand what she was meant to become. Keyleth emerged from the sealed chamber for the last time as the primary bridge between Margaret and the world. She was ancient now, and the weight of 40 years of secret keeping had bent her back and clouded her sight. But her mind was clear, clearer perhaps than it had ever been. She went to find Thomas. The king was in his study, reviewing documents related to the winter stores, making sure that Valdoria would be well provisioned for the coming cold months. He was 67 years old now, with gray in his hair and the comfortable weariness of a man who had ruled well and long. He looked up when Keyleth entered, and his face showed the deep affection he had always felt for the priestess. "Keyleth," he said, standing to greet her, "you look troubled. Come, sit. Tell me what weighs on your heart." The priestess settled into a chair, her old joints creaking audibly as she moved. For a long moment, she said nothing. She was choosing her words carefully, trying to find a way to speak truths that could not really be spoken. It existed in a realm beyond language. "My king," she finally said, "I need to tell you something about your dreams, about the certainties that come to you, about why you have been such a gifted ruler." Thomas sat back down slowly, his eyes narrowing with something like understanding. "You are going to tell me that I'm not as gifted as I've believed," he said quietly. "You're going to tell me that the wisdom hasn't come from my own mind." "No," Keyleth said. "I'm going to tell you something far stranger than that. I'm going to tell you about love, my king. About a love so vast and so persistent that it refused to be limited by death. I'm going to tell you about your mother." And there, in the king's study with the winter sun falling through the windows, Keyleth told the truth. Not all of it. She didn't reveal her own role, her own nightly vigils in the sealed chamber, the burden she had carried alone for so many years. But she told Thomas that Margaret had chosen to stay, that the queen had transformed herself into presence, into attentiveness, into the particular consciousness that watched over Valdoria and guided its king toward wisdom and justice. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Keyleth finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I think I've always known. Not with my mind, but with something deeper. I've always felt her presence, always known I was being watched over by something loving and wise. I thought it was just memory, just the lingering influence of a great teacher. But now you're telling me it's more than that." Margaret had chosen not to end. She had chosen to transform. She could no longer rule through edicts and law, could no longer hold court or make decisions from a throne. But she could rule through presence. She could become the attentiveness itself. She could become the consciousness of Valdoria, not as some mystical thing, not as a fairy tale, but as a simple truth. The kingdom beloved by its queen, so thoroughly that the queen as love had become woven into its very fabric. Where Margaret had looked, the kingdom would feel seen. Where Margaret cared, the kingdom would feel tended. Where the queen's will focused, the kingdom would find guidance, not through supernatural intervention, but through the simple accumulation of love, so vast and so persistent that it shaped the very air that people breathed. This was the understanding that came to Keyleth, and with it came the knowledge of her role. She had been chosen as the bridge. She didn't know how she knew this. It simply came to her, the way knowledge flows in dreams, as immediate and complete as though she had always known it. Margaret had seen into Keyleth's future, had seen that the priestess would live past the natural span, would remain sharp and aware and passionate about Valdoria long after other minds had begun to fade. Margaret had needed someone to help her in this strange new existence, someone to be the translator between the realm of presence and the realm of action. Keyleth rose to her knees and bowed deeply before the shimmer of light that had been her queen. "I understand," she said. "I will be your voice. I will be your bridge between the living and whatever you have become. I will speak your will into the world, and no one will ever know that what I speak comes not from my own mind, but from yours. I accept this. I accept all of it." The light that was Margaret swirled around the priestess, and Keyleth felt it touch her forehead. It was warm and familiar, and deeply, achingly strange. And in that moment of contact, Keyleth received the weight of what she had just agreed to. She understood that this would be loneliness like she had never known. She understood that she would carry this secret to her grave, that she would never be able to speak it aloud to anyone, that the burden of knowing would be hers alone until the day that Margaret allowed her to pass it on. She understood that she was no longer simply a priestess. She was now a keeper of mysteries, a guardian of a truth that would reshape history in ways that history would never acknowledge. And she understood that Margaret loved her for accepting this. The Queen's presence, vast and patient and infinite, conveyed a gratitude so complete that Keyleth found herself weeping, her face wet with tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her own body, as though she were crying for both of them, crying for the impossible beauty of what they had together agreed to. The residue faded slowly, drawing back into the corners of the chamber and then disappearing entirely. But the warmth remained. The warmth and the sense of presence, and something else, a kind of peace that Keyleth had never known before and would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. She left the chamber as dawn was breaking, and she sealed it again behind her. She returned to the Temple of the Seven Stars and resumed her duties as if nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. Everything had become strange and miraculous, and infinitely more difficult, and infinitely more meaningful all at once. What followed over the next 40 years was the strangest period in Valdorian history, though few people realized it was strange at all. To the outside world, Queen Margaret was dead, properly mourned, her ashes scattered in the traditional way. Her son, King Thomas, had assumed the throne as was proper. The succession was secure. The kingdom continued on its way. But Thomas ruled in a manner that seemed almost supernaturally gifted. Every decision he made seemed to bear fruit beyond measure. Every problem that arose found its solution almost before it fully manifested. The kingdom prospered in ways that other lands could not understand or replicate. Harvests doubled, then doubled again. Trade flourished. Even the kingdom's enemies seemed to lose interest in conquest, as though the fates themselves had turned favorable, or as though the kingdom was being guided by a hand more skilled than any visible rulers could be. Thomas himself often spoke of strange certainties that came to him in moments of confusion. He would be wrestling with a problem, a trade dispute with a neighboring kingdom, a question of taxation, a matter of succession in one of the great noble houses, and suddenly he would simply know the answer. It wouldn't come as a voice or vision. It would come as a certainty, a sudden clarity that felt as natural as his own thought. He would emerge from these moments saying things like, "I've been thinking about the drought in the eastern province," and then he would describe, in detail, exactly what should be done to alleviate it. When he implemented these ideas, they worked perfectly. He began to believe that he had simply grown into his role as king, that his mother's training had gone deeper than he had realized, that the confidence of office had finally awakened the latent talents he'd always possessed. In truth, Thomas was only half aware of his mother's presence. He felt her guidance like a good instinct, like the wisdom that comes from being raised by someone you love and respect. He attributed her suggestions to his own growing understanding of statecraft, to the maturation that comes with bearing a crown. He didn't understand that every moment of his rule was being shaped by a presence that existed outside the normal categories of life and death, by a queen who had transformed herself into pure attention focused entirely on the welfare of her people. Only Keyleth fully understood, and the priestess lived with that understanding as one lives, with a constant ache, something always present, always part of the body, something you eventually stop noticing because it's woven so thoroughly into the fabric of existence. Keyleth would spend hours in the sealed chamber that had once been Margaret's bedroom, though it was now transformed into something else, something that had no proper name. In this place, Keyleth would sit in silence and receive what Margaret needed to convey. It wasn't words. Words were too crude, too limited for what flowed between them. Instead, there was a kind of direct knowledge transfer. Keyleth would understand concepts and concerns that had no names, the way understanding flows in dreams, complete and whole, and somehow more real than words could ever make them. Margaret was still learning what it meant to exist as she now existed. She was still understanding the shape of her new purpose. The residue, the shimmer that Keyleth would sometimes glimpse, was not her body or even her spirit in any traditional sense. It was something like the material form of pure will, pure attention, pure love. She could move through the castle invisibly, could be present in multiple places at once, could attend to the kingdom in ways that her physical body had never been able to do. But she could not act directly in the world. She could not pick up a pen or move an object or speak words aloud. She could only be present, could only attend, could only focus the vast force of her will on guiding those who were sensitive enough to feel her presence. And standing in that room, surrounded by the map of their kingdom rendered in tile and stone, they would find clarity. Solutions would come to them, as though they had simply been waiting for the right moment and the right place to be found. Burdens would feel lighter. Those who were grieving would find their grief transformed, not disappeared, but changed into something they could carry, something that made them feel connected to something larger than themselves. Those who were lost would find direction. The sick would come seeking healing, and while not all of them were cured, for the chamber was not a place of miracles, not in any supernatural sense, many of them found something more valuable than a cure. They found the sense of being known completely, of being witnessed in their suffering, of being held by an attention so vast and so patient that it could contain their pain without being diminished by it. Word spread slowly through Valdoria about this remarkable room. At first, it was mainly the nobles and the priesthood who came, but gradually, people of all classes began to make the pilgrimage. A farmer would come seeking blessing for a failed harvest. A widow would come seeking peace after her husband's death. A child would come with a parent, learning that there were places in the world where it was possible to be fully present, fully attended to, fully loved. Eleanor knew what they didn't know, that Margaret wasn't just a memory. She was still there, in that room, in those moments. Still present, still paying attention, still ruling with the same careful love she had given them in life, now expressed through the particular gift of one who had learned to exist as pure attention, pure purpose, pure will focused entirely on the welfare of those she loved. The ancient queen was learning through Eleanor, and through the reactions of the people who came to the chamber, what it meant to pour oneness consciousness into a place in such a way that the place itself became conscious, became aware, became a medium through which love could flow. Eleanor lived to be 95 years old, near the end of her life, with her own daughter, preparing to become the next priestess. Eleanor gathered her children and grandchildren in her private chambers and told them a secret that had been passed down through 3 generations, from Keyleth to Thomas to Eleanor, and now to the next guardians of the mystery. Your great-great-grandmother, Queen Margaret, made a choice, Eleanor said, her voice still strong despite her ancient body. When she died, she was given the option to move on, as all souls should move on. But she chose differently. She chose to remain. She chose to transform herself into presence, into attentiveness, into the consciousness of this kingdom. She is still here. She is still watching over us. She will always be here as long as we need her, as long as we remember what she has chosen to do for us. Eleanor's granddaughter, who would become the next great chronicler of Valdorian history, asked a question that had haunted the family for generations. "Do you think she wants to leave?" she asked. "Do you think she's waiting for us to set her free?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes, clouded with age, but still sharp, seemed to be looking at something beyond the visible world. She reached out and took her granddaughter's hand. "No," she finally said, "I don't think she's waiting to leave. I think she's here because she wants to be. I think love, true love, isn't a chain that binds us even after death. I think it's a choice we make every day, every moment. And Margaret chooses Valdoria, chooses her people, the way you choose to love your children. Not out of obligation, but out of the deepest well of being. That's what she has become, the embodiment of that choice. Valdoria didn't lose its queen when she died. It gained something far more powerful, a queen whose love is not constrained by the needs of the body, but free to be pure presence, pure care, pure will for the good of those she loves. Eleanor closed her eyes, and those who were with her swore that they felt, one final time, that strange brightness filling the room. It hung around the dying woman like a benediction, like an embrace, like the presence of someone so loved, and so loving that even the boundary between life and death could uncontain them. When Eleanor died that night, she died peacefully, knowing that she had passed on the burden and the gift to the next generation. But she also died knowing something else, something that only she had fully understood. She died knowing that she had not needed to be the bridge between worlds. The bridge had been inside Margaret all along, had been the Queen's own consciousness, stretched thin and made invisible, spread throughout the kingdom like roots through soil. Eleanor had simply been the one who learned to speak what Margaret was always speaking. She had been the translator of an ongoing conversation that had never stopped, not for a moment, since the day that Margaret had chosen to remain. Centuries passed. Valdoria changed in the way that all kingdoms must change. New rulers came and went. Wars were fought and won and learned from. Famines came and went. Plagues arrived and were survived. The kingdom was invaded twice, once from the north and once from the south, and both times it defended itself without losing its essential character. Its borders expanded and contracted based on the currents of history. Its wealth fluctuated based on trade and fortune and the skill of its rulers. Its population grew and diversified. New religions arrived and were incorporated into the old faiths without violence or rejection. Through all of it, the chamber of presence remained. The room was no longer a secret, but it was also never quite a tourist attraction or a place that could be reduced to folklore. It remained what Eleanor had made it, a space where the attentive could feel themselves attended to. The map on the floor was updated every 100 years or so by careful artisans, making sure that new cities and roads were reflected in the tile work. But the essential form remained the same. Valdoria, exactly rendered, perfect in its proportions and its careful truth. And those who spent quiet moments in that room, whether they knew the story of Margaret or not, felt something remarkable. They felt seen. They felt as though the kingdom itself was conscious, was aware of their presence, their troubles, their potential. They felt, in a word, loved. Historians and universities throughout the known world wrote different interpretations of Valdoria's remarkable stability and prosperity. Some attributed it to particularly good fortune in choosing rulers, to the statistical improbability that so many capable monarchs would arise in succession. Others spoke of a unique cultural commitment to governance and communal care, a value system that had become embedded in the kingdom's institutions and traditions. Still others theorized about geographical advantages or economic benefits that had been particularly well managed over the centuries. But the people of Valdoria themselves knew something deeper, even if they couldn't always articulate it. They knew that their kingdom cared about them. They knew that decisions made by distant rulers often seemed to benefit them in ways that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. They knew that even in times of true hardship, droughts, epidemics, economic collapse, the hardship didn't feel pointless. It felt like something that was being carried together, that was being witnessed, that was being held within a framework of care that extended far beyond what any ordinary kingdom could offer. "It is," Keyleth said, "and it's time that you knew the full truth. It's time that you understood what has been done, what your mother has become, and what your daughter is about to become." Over the following weeks, Thomas began to initiate Eleanor into the mysteries. He did this carefully, gradually, building understanding rather than shocking revelation. He took his daughter to the sealed chamber and showed her the space where her grandmother's presence was most tangible. He explained about Margaret's choice, about Calith's role, about the strange and sacred duty that he now understood he had been given. Eleanor, at 14 years old, received this information with a composure that surprised her father. She didn't seem shocked. She didn't need time to process. Instead, she seemed to recognize what Thomas was telling her, as though he were explaining something she had always known, but had never had words for. "Grandmother is showing me," Eleanor said simply when Thomas asked her how she understood so quickly. "She's been showing me my whole life. I just didn't have the words for what I was seeing." Thomas took his daughter's hand, and together they stood in the sealed chamber in the space where Margaret's presence was most strong, and they felt as clearly as it was possible to feel the attention of a great queen who loved her kingdom so completely that she had chose to remain in it forever. Eleanor became the new bridge. She didn't replace Keyleth. The priestess lived for another 3 years, serving as mentor and guide to the young woman who would inherit her role. But gradually, over those 3 years, Eleanor took on more and more of the work. She began to receive the direct communications from Margaret. She began to be the one who translated the Queen's will into counsel that Thomas could follow. She began to spend long hours in the sealed chamber, learning to exist in the peculiar state of consciousness that Margaret had developed, learning to be present to both the physical world and the realm of pure attention that her grandmother now inhabited. On the night that Keyleth died, she was alone in her chambers in the Temple of the 7 Stars. She had lived past 90 years of age, had served 2 kings, and had been the sole keeper of the greatest secret in Valdorian history. Her last night was quiet and peaceful. No one was with her. When the temple attendants found her in the morning, she was still in her bed, her face serene, her eyes closed as though she were simply sleeping. But those who had been close to her swore that they saw, in the chamber where she had died, a brightness like nothing they had ever seen. It was as if light itself had become concentrated in that space, as if the very air had turned luminous. And when they looked at Keyleth's face, the priestess seemed to be smiling. She seemed to be smiling as though she had just been greeted by someone beloved, someone she had been waiting for, someone she had loved more than life itself. Valdoria mourned Keyleth as it mourned all its great ones. But no one knew what they had truly lost. No one but Eleanor and Thomas and Margaret, the 3 who understood that the priestess had finally been able to set down a burden that had been hers alone for nearly half a century. Eleanor ruled as high priestess after Keyleth's death, and she served that role for 60 years. She was a remarkable woman, brilliant, compassionate, and deeply aware of the strange destiny that had been placed upon her. She made changes to the Temple of the 7 Stars, transforming it from an institution focused primarily on ritual and ceremony into one that emphasized presence and attentiveness. She trained priests and priestesses to cultivate a particular kind of awareness, a sensitivity to the ways that love and intention could shape the world around them. And she continued to be the bridge between Margaret and the living world, translating the Queen's vast understanding into counsel that Thomas and later his successors could follow. Years passed. Thomas died when he was 90 years old, full of years and honor. His final days were spent in the sealed chamber with Eleanor and several other witnesses who had been brought into the secret. His last words were spoken to the air, to something no one else in the room could see. "Thank you," he said, "for never leaving, for loving us so completely that even death couldn't stop it, for teaching me what it really means to be a king." And those who were present swore that they saw, just for a moment, a brightness gather around the dying king. They understood, though they didn't fully know why, that he was being welcomed by something vast and gentle and infinitely patient. Eleanor ruled for 61 years. She had married a prince from a neighboring kingdom, a man who was brought into the secret early in their courtship, who understood what Margaret was and what Eleanor had become. Together, they had 3 children, and Eleanor made sure each one understood their grandmother's choice and their own role in carrying that understanding forward. But Eleanor did something that Keyleth and Thomas had never done. She began carefully and gradually to transform the secret into something less secret. She didn't expose it fully. It would have been destructive, would have turned a sacred trust into folklore, a profound truth into a story that people would struggle to believe. But she opened the sealed chamber to others. She stopped calling it the Queen's Hess Chamber and began to call it simply the Chamber of Presence. She decorated it simply nothing so grand as to suggest artifice, but enough to make it clear that this was a room of purpose. She commissioned an artist to create a great map of Valdoria on the floor, rendered in tiles of many colors, so accurate that you could trace the course of every river, the location of every major city and settlement. She made it beautiful, but more than that, she made it true. She suggested that those who were troubled or uncertain should come to this room and, standing in the map of their kingdom, simply think of their queen. Think of her care for them. Think of her presence watching over them. To the common people, this was merely a custom, a spiritual practice. They would come to the chamber and think of Margaret, a figure becoming legendary, a queen whose memory had taken on almost mythical proportions. They would think of her love for Valdoria, her dedication, her unfailing presence in the lives of her subjects. Some came seeking solutions to specific problems. Others came simply seeking comfort, seeking the sense of being seen and cared for that seemed to radiate from the room itself. One man, an old philosopher named Demon, who had lived through 3 reigns and written extensively about Valdorian culture, finally wrote the truth as he understood it late in his life. He titled his essay, "The Kingdom Beloved," and in it he speculated that nations like individuals could be loved so completely and so persistently that the love itself became a force, a presence, a kind of attention that shaped the fundamental character of a place. Perhaps, he wrote, love is not merely an emotion of individuals. Perhaps it can accumulate. Perhaps it can become a structure, a foundation, an atmosphere. Perhaps there are places on this world that have been loved so thoroughly and by such great hearts that the love becomes encoded into the very earth, woven into the stones and soil, breathed into the air that the people breathe. And perhaps those of us who live in such places, who are born into such love, inherit not just a kingdom or a nation, but a way of being, a curriculum in caring, a demonstration of what it means to hold something precious enough that you refuse to let it go, even when the ordinary forms of holding are no longer available to you. Demon's essay was read and discussed in universities and parliaments throughout the known world. It was taught to children in Valdorian schools. It became part of Valdorian philosophy, taught alongside more practical studies of governance and trade. And the people of Valdoria began to understand, perhaps even more deeply than Eleanor had understood, that the love their kingdom had inherited was not a luxury, not a curious anomaly, but a responsibility. That inheriting the care of a great queen meant learning to become queens and kings themselves, not of territories, but of their own relationships, their own families, their own small spheres of influence. They began to live differently, not through force, not through the imposition of new laws or the restructuring of society, but through the slow osmosis of growing up in a place that had been cared for so thoroughly, so patiently, for so long. Parents began to teach their children with a particular attention, the way Margaret had taught Thomas to be a king, not through instruction alone, but through presence, through the modeling of what it meant to pay attention, to care deeply, to notice and respond to the needs of those you love. Teachers began to instruct with the care of those who understood that they were shaping the future that Margaret was still invested in. Even the poorest laborer, the lowest servant, and most outcast member of society seemed to carry within them a certain dignity, a sense that they mattered, that they were part of something worth protecting, that they were held in the attention of something greater than themselves. Valdoria didn't become perfect. Perfection is not the province of kingdoms or people. People still made mistakes. Rulers still sometimes made poor decisions. Crimes were still committed. Injustice still occurred. But the culture of the kingdom developed a particular relationship to failure and error. When things went wrong, there was accountability, yes, but also compassion. When someone erred, they were not simply punished, they were helped to understand what had gone wrong and how to do better. A kingdom became a place where people believed that change was possible, that redemption was available, that everyone deserved another chance, because everyone was held in attention, was seen, was fundamentally valued. 1,500 years after Margaret's death, a new kind of scholar emerged in Valdoria. Not a historian or a philosopher, but someone who studied the mechanics of attention itself. This scholar, a woman named Lyris, became fascinated by the chamber of presence and the way that it seemed to function. She was trained in the emerging sciences of her time, the early versions of what would become psychology and neuroscience. She spent years in careful observation of the chamber, taking measurements of light and temperature, recording the patterns that seemed to form and reform in the dust on the map over time. What Lyris discovered through her careful scientific work was this: the patterns weren't random. They were responsive. When people entered the chamber with specific questions or concerns, a farmer wondering whether to plant a particular crop, a noblewoman uncertain about whether to marry a particular suitor, a child grieving the loss of a parent, the dust would arrange itself in particular ways. Nothing so obvious as to be suspicious, nothing that would have convinced a committed skeptic, but statistical significance nonetheless. The dust seemed to respond to the emotional weight of the person's presence. It seemed to offer guidance, not through vision or voice, but through the subtle geometry of arrangement, through patterns that the mind could interpret in ways that brought clarity. Lyris's scholarly conclusions were cautious. She suggested that perhaps the chamber functioned as a kind of mirror, that perhaps human intuition and the patterns that people perceived were deeply connected. She suggested that perhaps belief itself shaped reality in ways that science hadn't yet fully explored. She wrote papers that her colleagues found interesting but unprovable, that suggested possibilities without making claims that could be definitively tested. But what Lyris didn't mention in her formal papers, what she only discussed with her closest colleagues and her children, was what she felt every time she entered the chamber. She felt a presence. Not threatening, not demanding, but patient and attentive and deeply, achingly concerned with her well-being. She felt as though she were being known completely, the way you are known to yourself, the way your own consciousness knows all of your contradictions and fears and hopes, and never rejects you for them. She felt, in short, loved in a way that transcended any ordinary form of love between people. And she made a decision, as each generation of Valdorians eventually did. She decided to become one of the carriers of this love. She made it her life's work to teach people about the chamber of presence, to help them understand what it offered, to help them learn to feel in their own lives the particular quality of attention that Margaret had poured into her kingdom. She began to teach a practice of attentiveness, showing people how to bring the awareness they experienced in the chamber into their daily lives, how to hold that kind of gentle, non-judgmental presence with the people they encountered. Lyris had a daughter, and she taught her daughter as Eleanor had taught her children. She taught her that the chamber was real, that the presence within it was real, that the love was real. But she also taught her that the point was not to rely on the chamber alone, not to make it a crutch or a substitute for their own growth. She taught that the point was to learn from it, to learn how to be present to others the way the chamber was present to them, to learn how to love a place or a person or a purpose so completely that even the ordinary limitations of time and mortality couldn't contain it. Lyris's daughter became a healer, and she carried her mother's teaching with her into clinics and homes and hospitals. She taught her patients that healing wasn't just about curing disease or alleviating symptoms, but about making people feel genuinely seen and cared for. She taught that the quality of attention itself was medicine, that being held in the awareness of someone who truly cared could facilitate healing in ways that drugs and surgery alone could never achieve. And she passed this understanding on to her children, who passed it to theirs, creating a lineage of healers who understood that their role was not just to fix broken bodies, but to offer the gift of presence, the gift of being witnessed and valued and held. 2,300 years after Margaret's death, Valdoria was struck by a plague unlike anything in its history. It was called the Silence because it didn't manifest as fever or infection in the traditional sense. Instead, it began as a disconnection. People would wake up and find that they couldn't feel the presence of others around them anymore. A mother couldn't feel her child's need. A ruler couldn't sense the welfare of his people. A healer couldn't perceive the suffering of her patient. The plague didn't kill not directly, but it created a terrible isolation. People were still physically present to each other, but the invisible threads of connection and attunement that had always held Valdorian society together began to fray and break. It was as though the kingdom itself was losing consciousness, losing the ability to feel, to care, to attend. And as people lost their connection to each other, they became desperate. To stop the spread, people had to isolate themselves completely. Families were separated. The sick could not be touched. The dying could not be held. Those who had been well were forced into solitude to prevent infection. And with each day of isolation, the ability to feel connected to others diminished further. For the first time since Margaret had made her choice, the people of Valdoria felt the profound absence of her presence. Not because she was not gone, but because the mechanisms through which her care could be felt seemed to fail. The chamber of presence had to be closed, sealed off to prevent the spread of the plague. Gatherings became impossible. The attention that had always flowed through community, through touch and proximity and shared space, could no longer flow in those ways. It was as though the kingdom's attentiveness to itself was being systematically severed. People despaired in ways they had never despaired before. They felt, for the first time in centuries, genuinely alone. They felt as though the love that had always held them was being withdrawn. They began to wonder if everything they had heard about Margaret, about the chamber, about the kingdom being beloved by its dead queen had simply been folklore storytelling, the invention of a desperate people trying to find meaning in a purposeless universe. But something remarkable happened in that loneliness. In the absence of Margaret's mediated presence, people began to understand, in ways they had never understood before, that the love they had inherited from the Queen was not something external that they could rely on. It was not a gift that could be taken away. It was something they had to become themselves. It was a teaching, not a comfort. It was a curriculum, not a conclusion. Alone in their isolated homes, people began to pay attention to each other in new ways. They learned to be present through closed doors, through windows, through written words and careful gestures. A widow in the lower city took it upon herself to check on her neighbors by counting coughs and silences, listening at their doors, establishing patterns, knowing that if a certain neighbor didn't cough at their usual time in the evening, something was wrong and help was needed. A healer in a remote village learned to give medical advice through notes passed under doors, and then began to realize that the act of writing those notes, of taking the time to think through each person's individual situation and craft a response specific to them, was itself a form of healing, even if the advice had limited effect on the physical disease. Families separated by the plague created rituals of connection, lighting candles at the same time in the evening, sharing meals apart that were still eaten together in spirit, calling out across empty streets to hear a loved one's voice one more time. A teacher in the capital began a practice of reading books aloud from her window, and neighbors would gather at their own windows and doors, separated by distance and walls, but united in the experience of hearing words, of being together in the sharing of stories. Children too young to understand the plague nonetheless understood that they could still feel loved, still feel connected to their parents through the particular attention that those parents were learning to give them despite the physical barriers. Slowly, without anyone quite realizing it was happening, Valdoria was learning to become what Margaret had become. The kingdom was learning to exist as pure attention, as consciousness without the necessity of physical proximity. People were learning that love didn't require touch, that presence didn't require proximity, that attunement didn't require being in the same room. And as this learning deepened, something remarkable occurred. The plague began to fade, not because anyone had found a cure no cure was ever developed, but because people were no longer desperate to touch and gather and be close. They had learned a different way of being together, a way that didn't require physical contact. The very behavior that had been feeding the plague, the desperate seeking of contact and comfort, began to change. People learned to find comfort in attention from a distance. They learned to feel held by awareness rather than by arms. They learned that presence was not synonymous with proximity. When the plague finally ended, after years of isolation and learning, Valdoria emerged transformed. The kingdom had learned through bitter necessity what Margaret had been trying to teach for 3,000 years, that the deepest forms of connection transcend physical form, that love is not dependent on proximity, that attention is the fundamental currency of relationship. The chamber of presence was reopened, but something had changed in the hearts of those who entered it. The patterns in the dust were different now. They were simpler, more straightforward. And those who entered the chamber found themselves not asking for direction or guidance, not seeking solutions to specific problems. Instead, they found themselves offering it. They found themselves thinking not about what they needed, but about what the kingdom needed, what their community needed, what their families needed. They found themselves, in a word, ruling, not from a throne, but from their homes, their workplaces, their hearts. They had inherited Margaret's crown by finally fully understanding that a queen is not someone who is served, but someone who serves, and that the service doesn't end not even with death, not even when the nature of the service must be transformed. The kingdom began to heal from the plague, not through medicine, but through the transformation of consciousness that the plague had forced upon them. And the people of Valdoria understood, perhaps more deeply than they had ever understood before, that they were not living in a kingdom that was loved by a dead queen. They were living in a kingdom that was becoming that love, learning to embody it, learning to pass it on. 1,000 more years would pass. Valdoria would change beyond recognition in some ways, while remaining essentially itself in others. Technologies would be invented that made much of what Margaret had taught seem quaint or obsolete, but the fundamental truths would remain the same. Ways of living would emerge that she could not have imagined in her living life. New forms of family, new kinds of work, new ways of organizing society. But underneath all of these changes, the current of attentiveness would flow, the inheritance of a queen who had learned to love her kingdom across the boundary between life and death. New peoples would arrive and add their own values and traditions to Valdoria's culture, their own stories to the kingdom's narrative. Some of them brought religions that were different from the traditional Valdorian faiths. Some of them brought practices and ways of thinking that seemed to contradict the teachings of Margaret. But over time, all of these different traditions found a way to coexist in Valdoria. The kingdom became a place where many truths could be held simultaneously, where different ways of understanding the world could be woven together without destroying each other. This too was part of Margaret's legacy, the understanding that love was vast enough to contain contradiction, that attention could hold multiple perspectives without needing to choose between them. Through all of the changes, the chamber of presence would remain. Through all of the centuries, the story would be passed down. Sometimes it would be passed down in the form of explicit history, taught in schools and universities as one of the kingdom's founding narratives. Sometimes it would be passed down in the form of art or music or literature stories about a queen who loved her kingdom so much that she refused to leave it even after death. Sometimes the story would be passed down simply in the form of a certain quality of attention that Valdorians seemed to carry a certain way of being present to those they loved, that suggested they had learned it from someone from a queen who had never truly left. And if you were to visit Valdoria, if you were to travel to its capital, and make your way to the ancient chamber with its map of the kingdom rendered in colored tile. If you were to stand there in the dust and the light and simply allow yourself to be present, to be attended to, you might feel it yourself. You might feel standing there in that space, that vast, patient, attentive presence that had been paying attention to this place and these people for more than 3,000 years. You might feel for just a moment what it was like to be seen completely, to be known entirely, to be loved so thoroughly and so persistently that even death couldn't diminish it, that even the transformation of physical form into something altogether different couldn't weaken it. And if you were sensitive to such things, if you had learned to pay attention the way that Valdorians had learned to pay attention, you might understand that this was not a haunting. This was not a tragedy prolonged. This was not a ghost bound by trauma or regret or the inability to accept death. This was something far more beautiful and far stranger. The transformation of one queen's love into the very air that Valdoria breathed, into the light that fell on its mountains, into the particular quality of welcome that its people extended to strangers and friends alike. This was a queen who had learned to rule not through power, but through the perfection of presence itself, who had learned to be a kingdom the way she had learned to be a woman, with complete attention, with unfailing care, with the understanding that love is not a thing you have, but a choice you make, again and again, moment after moment, generation after generation, choosing to stay, choosing to care, choosing to be there for those who had captured your heart. This was the queen of the empty court, and her kingdom had learned, in time, to become worthy of her love by giving that love forward, pouring it out, making it the foundation of all things. They had learned that the inheritance of a great queen's love was not a gift to be received passively, but an active responsibility to be lived into, practiced daily, refined through experience and mistake and trial. This is the story of what happens when someone loves something so completely that death itself cannot contain it. This is the story of a kingdom that became conscious of being cared for, and because of that consciousness, learned to care for itself. This is the story of a love that spanned thousands of years, that transformed the nature of what it meant to be alive, that showed that the boundaries we think are absolute, the boundary between life and death, between individual and place, between presence and absence, are perhaps far more permeable than we imagine. This is the story of Valdoria, and the love that would not leave.